Get Out redefined horror. Antebellum tried to rewrite history. But there's still one place horror refuses to go. This wasn't just a wedding venue. It was the largest surviving antebellum mansion in America, and it just burned to the ground. Tourists posed beneath these columns built by enslaved hands. And when the fire started, it wasn't just a building that burned. It was the illusion. Because horror avoids places like this, not because they aren't terrifying, but because they are too real. This is a setting horror still won't touch. Let's talk about why.
This is a class on the literature of the American South. You're going to encounter some archaic thoughts, coarse language, but we're all adults here, and I think we can understand it within the context in which it's written.
There's an unspoken rule in modern horror. Some places are just off limits. Not because they aren't scary, but because they're too scary, too real, too political. You can set a horror film in a suburb, an asylum, a cabin in the woods, but there's one place horror refuses to go. A place that should be the most terrifying of all, and yet it's almost never touched. Hollywood loves horror. It's turned neighborhoods into nightmares. But there's one place that should be the most terrifying of all. In this video essay, we analyze modern horror films like Antebellum and Get Out, alongside historical works like Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. We'll uncover how history and horror collide, and why this untapped subgenre is one modern audiences don't even know they're hungry for. And in the process, we identify 3 essential characteristics that need to be present to create a new style of horror. Is Hollywood ready for the most terrifying setting of all? If horror is about reckoning with the past, then why have we ignored the one setting screaming for it? A haunted house is terrifying because of what happened inside it. The echoes of violence, the lingering spirits of unfinished stories. A plantation should be even more horrifying. And yet, instead of horror, Hollywood made them something else. Something softer. Something sanitized. How would we go about telling the story? And when a place like Nottoway, the crown jewel of plantation tourism, burns to the ground, maybe it's time to stop treating plantations like charming relics and start recognizing the horror they were built on. Hollywood's engagement with slavery has a history as contested as the plantation itself. It's challenging to pinpoint where this began, as the portrayal of plantations in horror films varies. Should we focus on slave narratives versus the lost cause? Should we talk about the difference between horror and Gothic literature? The Victorian mansion versus the plantation? What truly makes something scary? But first, we will explore all of these and more, and hopefully find a way to discern what would a film need to follow to make a horror film on a plantation work. Maybe it's not that we shouldn't make a horror film on a plantation. Maybe they just need to be executed in a way that we've not seen yet. How do we go from a place of terror to a place of tourism?
This is not okay. And this is an 1830s slave cabin that is up on Airbnb as a bed and breakfast.
Jill Scott, completely bewildered, very upset. Jill recently recounted taking a tour at a former slave plantation that she says was marketed as a cozy bed and breakfast.
That people come from around the world to stay in. They offered me the slave quarters. I bet you wouldn't be going to no bed and breakfast at Auschwitz.
So why do plantations get a pass?
Chew on that.
And yet, plantations, where generations endured unimaginable horrors, are repackaged as charming getaways. Maybe the real horror has already been rewritten. So if horror wants to confront truth, it has to start by tearing down the myths we've built. Myths that came from plantation fiction. For nearly 2 centuries, plantation fiction has turned sites of suffering into symbols of nostalgia. No film did this more successfully than Gone with the Wind. But Gone with the Wind didn't start this trend. It was just Hollywood's biggest blockbuster adaptation of a narrative that had been shaping America's memory for decades. And the fight over how plantations and slavery itself would be remembered began long before the first motion picture. Plantation fiction, also called plantation tradition, is a genre that romanticizes the pre-Civil War South. Think charming mansions, genteel families, and enslaved people treated like loyal servants. Basically, historical fan fiction that erases the horror. The first major work of plantation fiction, Swallow Barn, presented a nostalgic sketch of antebellum Virginia life. The novel dwells on the picturesque routines of plantation society, while also painted enslaved people as content and safe. But its author, John Pendleton Kennedy, may have thought differently. In private, he called slavery a curse, and scholars believed he edited harsher truths out of his manuscript. After Uncle Tom's Cabin lit a fire under abolitionist literature, pro-slavery writers pushed back with anti-Tom novels. Books that rebranded slavery as family, pain as loyalty, violence as virtue. And after the South lost the war, a new narrative emerged, the lost cause. From the 1870s through the mid-20th century, the lost cause framed the Confederacy as noble, the war as tragic, and slavery as benign. One of the most prolific voices in shaping this myth was Thomas Dixon. A North Carolina preacher turned novelist, Dixon was furious over Uncle Tom's Cabin, so he wrote a trilogy to justify slavery and reshape American memory. One of those books, The Klansman. It became the basis for The Birth of a Nation, Hollywood's first blockbuster. A film so influential it screened at the White House. President Wilson reportedly called it like writing history with lightning. And what does this have to do with horror? Everything. One of Hollywood's first major feature films wasn't just a distorted retelling of plantation life. It was a cultural event, a box office smash. To some white audiences in the South, Birth of a Nation was a nostalgic epic, glorifying the rise of the Klan. But to black audiences living through night raids and racial terror, it was horror. This divide in perspective has existed since the dawn of cinema. Even the NAACP mobilized against Birth of a Nation, understanding the horror of how stories shaped memories. What one group sees as triumphant, another sees as terrifying. And this narrative didn't vanish after the film faded. The Lost Cause myth gained momentum through memorials, textbooks, and Hollywood. And that may be why the unspoken trope remains. Why horror has never fully reckoned with the plantation. In this video, we're breaking that rule. We're pulling back the curtain, because the unspoken trope in modern horror isn't just what's shown, it's what's avoided. Black storytellers didn't take this lying down. Oscar Micheaux, one of the first black filmmakers, responded to Birth of a Nation with his own film, Within Our Gates. It tackled the messy truth of Reconstruction, even showing how colorism fractured white Southern families. The film was banned in many cities, but it fought back against the plantation myth. Even within the plantation fiction, black writers carved out space for truth. In 1890, Charles W. Chestnut published The Gooford Grapevine, a folktale that critiqued Northern greed through folklore. You can watch our reimagining at the link above. And then there's Frank Yerby. In 1946, Yerby became the first African American to sell over 1 million copies of a novel, The Foxes of Harrow. He used all the tropes of plantation fiction, except one. His enslaved characters weren't caricatures. They had agency, resistance, humanity. That same year, Foxes was adapted by 20th Century Fox. It even got an Oscar nomination for Best Production Design. In one scene, a mother attempts to take her and her child's life instead of subjecting them to slavery. A devastating image, and one we'd see again almost 40 years later, in a book we'll discuss later. This scene from Gone with the Wind shows Scarlett O'Hara fighting to protect Trope Plantation as a Union soldier breaks in to pillage. Her character's journey mirrors the South's arc: wealthy before the war, devastated during, and reclaiming its former glory after. Or at least that's the myth, the unspoken trope. This idea of a decaying home as a symbol of lost values isn't unique to historical drama. It's also a recurring theme in horror, and will actually appear in Victorian mansions as well. Let's start by looking at some recent films that dealt with horror on plantations, most notably 2020's Antebellum starring Janelle Monáe. Antebellum is a modern-day retelling of a woman who was forced to go back to 19th century Antebellum South and live as an enslaved person. This film had a lot going for it. It starred Janelle Monáe, it had Oscar-nominated production designers, it was made by the same producers of Get Out, and yet the audience reaction was mixed at best. But we think there's some valuable lessons here from the film that can help us draw a path toward what we hope is a new subgenre of horror, one that may live within the context of Southern Gothic, but specifically focused on plantation horror. Here are the filmmakers of Antebellum talking about their inspiration behind making the movie.
If you look at Gone with the Wind, I think it's a horror film.
Actually use the exact same lens and show the antebellum South, not for the romanticized version that we saw back then, but for the actual horror it was.
You heard that right. Gone with the Wind cast such a long shadow on our industry, these filmmakers actually use lenses from the movie. But do audiences want this? Or is it that plantation fiction is so popular and domineering that any film that engages on a plantation is encroaching on Gone with the Wind or Birth of a Nation, even a century later? By the end of this video, you'll have some ideas of how Antebellum could have been done differently, and why using the lens of Gone with the Wind may have done more to revere the title as opposed to subvert it. So at this point, we've talked about Gone with the Wind and its influence on modern cinema. Hollywood has spent decades rewriting plantations as sites of nostalgia, but don't take my word for it. Let's ask Google and search for horror movies on a plantation. Let's see the films that come up. Antebellum, Skeleton Key, I Walked with a Zombie. Okay, but do you notice something? It doesn't seem like that's a complete list. Now let's try something different. Let's search for movies shot on a plantation. 12 Years a Slave, Django Unchained, even Gone with the Wind pop up, The Notebook. We'll get to that later. So, romance, historical drama, Southern Gothic, even Forrest Gump. But where's the horror? Meanwhile, hundreds of horror films have been shot in Victorian mansions. It's almost like the algorithm itself struggles to connect plantations with horror. The haunted house is one of horror's most iconic settings, but a plantation, an actual site of historical trauma, that's still a backdrop for weddings. But how do we even begin to tackle this topic? We may need to take a look at Gothic literature. If horror is about facing the fears we bury, then what does it say that we still won't treat plantations like haunted houses? What is Hollywood and history trying to avoid? Plantation fiction didn't just influence Hollywood, it trained audiences to see slavery through a nostalgic lens. These films didn't just soften the past, they rewrote it. So what's the remedy? You might be surprised to learn another genre has already been doing the hard work of subversion. Plantations aren't easy subjects. You don't gather the family on a Friday night to watch a movie about slavery. But if we ever want to build this new genre, plantation horror, we have to knock the plantation off its pedestal, honor the trauma, confront the myths, and find a way to reclaim the story. Strangely enough, that path might start with comedy. Here's the twist. When horror flinches, comedy steps in. Not drama, not action, satire. Maybe the only genre brave enough to haunt the past. Before Get Out, Jordan Peele was already using comedy to engage with history. Key and Peele wasn't just sketch comedy, it was satire. In one sketch, Peele imagines Harriet Tubman as a free runner, literally sprinting throughout history.
And follow me to freedom!
It's absurd, but the absurdity is the point.
But where is she now?
Another sketch flips the horror of the auction block. Two enslaved men get mad no one bids on them. It's funny until you realize the pain underneath.
They better kill me the first day, or I'm gonna go buck wild on the whole operation.
Okay. Next one, get up on up there now.
Comedy isn't soft, it's surgical.
What could he pick? A cotton plant is like this tall. Yes. I'm saying, no offense, brother. I'm just saying.
Offense taken.
What?
It slices through the sanitized stories we're used to hearing about slavery and begins the work of pulling the plantation off its pedestal. Jill Scott said it earlier.
I bet you wouldn't be going to no bed and breakfast at Auschwitz.
She's right. But other films, like Jojo Rabbit and Glorious Bastards, use satire and revenge to reframe historical trauma. They highlight the absurdity of evil while still confronting pain. So, could horror do the same with slavery? Could satire be the bridge? Turns out the blueprint already exists in horror itself. Get Out doesn't just use satire, it weaponizes it. The film takes the language of politeness, the I would have voted for Obama a third time liberalism, and twists it into a trap. Satire becomes survival. Wes Craven didn't just scare us, he bent reality. He gave us nightmare with rules.
Watch this.
And then there's magical realism. Magical realism doesn't just bend reality. It breaks the rules to reveal deeper truths. Think of it like horror's poetic cousin. It doesn't scream, it whispers something unsettling. In Pan's Labyrinth, the fairy tale isn't an escape. It's the only way to survive a fascist regime. And in the Underground Railroad, the train isn't metaphor. It's real. A steel spine running beneath the American soil, connecting hope to horror. It wasn't comedy, but it offered something: imagination, escape, possibility. Because horror and satire share one secret, they distort the world just enough to expose the truth.
The movie is very heavy at times, obviously.
Yes.
Not only is it a horror movie, but it talks about race a lot.
Yeah.
But there's also great moments of levity. And on top of that, because Jordan is so funny, would he direct in character? Is this true?
Yeah, scenes got heavy, and there was this dinner conversation that's very fraught, and we had to be laughing at the beginning. And Jordan could tell that we weren't laughing anymore. We started directing us as Obama. He started doing Tracy Morgan.
Oh, that's the right order. Yeah.
Which was perfect.
Yeah.
But there are perks to being directed by like a comedic genius. When you're doing like really serious, you know, not so funny, organically stuff.
We were talking about whether or not the movie is a comedy.
Yeah.
And he was saying black people think it's hilarious.
Yes.
Message!
Jordan Peele wasn't the first to mix horror, comedy, and history. In 1940, Spencer Williams Jr., best known as part of Amos and Andy, wrote one of the earliest horror comedies to explore race, Son of Ngagi. Though directed by a white filmmaker, it was groundbreaking as one of the first black-written genre films with an all-black cast. And of course, there's a scary movie franchise by the Wayans family, a parody empire that showed satire could thrive even when horror flinched. But did you know the Amos and Andy radio show used music from The Birth of a Nation as its theme song? Yeah, look it up. These aren't isolated coincidences. They're echoes. They point to a deeper pattern Hollywood never fully confronted. Even Gone with the Wind, often called a love letter to the Old South, includes moments where characters question slavery and Southern arrogance. When Rhett says, all we've got is cotton and slaves and arrogance. But does that one line undo 2 hours of Confederate nostalgia? Or does it just help the myth go down smoother? That kind of ambiguity is dangerous, because what we don't name festers. What we romanticize becomes ritual. And sometimes that ritual becomes sacred, even profitable. Gone with the Wind, like Birth of a Nation, became a cornerstone of the lost cause. It wouldn't be until Glory in 1989, that Hollywood finally offered a mainstream Civil War story centered on the cause of emancipation. So why does all this matter? Because if we're going to create a new genre, plantation horror, we have to confront the silent assumptions that built the last one. Today, plantations aren't just film sets. They're wedding venues, tourist attractions, and that tells us something. America hasn't divorced itself from this myth. Remember that viral Airbnb listing? The one advertising a stay in a slave cabin? After backlash, Airbnb apologized. Properties that formerly housed the enslaved have no place on Airbnb. But here's the twist. The new owner said it was never a slave cabin to begin with. It had been a sharecropper's home, a doctor's office. So, what's worse, profiting off slavery's trauma or faking it? Before it was removed, the listing had glowing reviews. Guests called it magnificent. People willingly slept in what they believed was a slave cabin. This is the power of unchecked myths. When plantations are seen as rustic charm instead of traumatic sites, we let the myth live on. Plantation fiction doesn't just distort history, it turns places of terror into places of tourism. How do we unearth the past without turning pain into spectacle? Maybe the answer lies in the genre horror owes so much to: Gothic fiction. Gothic horror gave us haunted houses and cursed family myths. But what if it's been haunted by something else all along? The ghosts aren't just in the attic. They're baked into the stories we were told. We are still excavating, still unlearning, still rewriting. Because horror isn't just about the things that go bump in the night. It's about the systems that refuse to die. The same homes we romanticize are literally crumbling. Nottoway Plantation, once billed as the White Castle of the South, is now ash. Maybe horror doesn't need to invent a haunting. It's already here. We've talked a lot about how plantations are framed through romance, sweeping camera moves, elaborate weddings. But as Toni Morrison reminds us, this isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a strategy. One of the ways nations would accommodate slavery's degradation was by brute force. Another was to romance it. Romanticization, especially when it softens sites of trauma, can become a form of erasure, disguising terror as tradition, to replace the screams with violins. This isn't just Hollywood's oversight, it's part of a deeper cultural reflex, to make atrocity look elegant. What is horror? We've been asking that for millennia. From ancient myths to modern campfires, it's how we confront the things we fear most. Death, the unknown, the things we don't see but feel crawling underneath. Modern horror, it owes much to Gothic literature. Those 18th and 19th century stories filled with rotting mansions, madness, and the unspeakable. John P. Kennedy, one of the earliest writers of plantation fiction, actually mentored a young Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe, he would go on to shape American Gothic horror. Gothic horror is all about dread and decay. Haunted houses, cursed families, buried secrets. Think the fall of the House of Usher. But Toni Morrison had a different read. In Playing in the Dark, Morrison argued that American Gothic was haunted not just by madness or death, but by race. She said writers like Poe relied on blackness as a shadow, a looming, ghostly presence. Not black people as characters, but blackness as a kind of haunting. Always there, never acknowledged. And from that shadow, another literary tradition emerged, Southern Gothic. Remember how we started this video? This is the opening of the 2023 Oscar-winning film, American Fiction. In American Fiction, a black professor gets suspended for teaching a Southern Gothic story. The kicker? A white student says she's uncomfortable with the N-word, even though it's from a Flannery O'Connor text he's assigned.
Think that word on the board is wrong?
That's the satire. But here's the sting. A black writer teaching a white author's racism gets punished for making the room uncomfortable. So, if Southern Gothic makes people flinch, imagine what plantation horror might expose. Southern Gothic is a uniquely American genre that combines a Gothic tradition with the specific cultural trauma of the American South. It's full of grotesque characters, moral decay, and crumbling aristocracy, but often skirts around the actual horror of slavery. Many of its early writers, William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Tennessee Williams, were products of their time. They used racial tropes, they tiptoed around slavery, and even as they critiqued Southern society, they often preserved its myths. Southern Gothic rose in the shadow of real events, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, but often buried the root causes of the region's decay. Kennedy softened slavery, Poe spiritualized it. Both treated blackness as the other, but never the center. We'll talk more about the other in horror with critiques from Robin Wood, Toni Morrison, and others later in this series. It's not just what we show, it's what we choose not to show. That haunting silence, it didn't stay in books, it followed us into the movies. Maybe that's why Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte can drench itself in Southern rot, but never name slavery. That silence, it's not accidental, it's the unspoken trope. As Morrison writes, this innocence is part of the construction of American whiteness, a way to disavow the truth while still feeding off its tension. Two men fishing in a quiet lake. But the deeper they go, the darker it gets. We learn the lake is haunted because beneath the surface lies a sunken town, flooded, buried, forgotten. The show is referencing Lake Lanier, a real reservoir in Georgia. In the 1950s, the government displaced over 250 families, moved 20 cemeteries, and submerged entire towns, many black, many erased. There's a folktale surrounding Lake Lanier. It's named after Confederate veteran and poet Sidney Lanier, that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built after flooding in 1956. It destroyed over 50,000 acres of farmland and displaced about 250 families, 15 businesses, and relocated 20 cemeteries, but local folklore says maybe they didn't. In this episode of Atlanta, Lake Lanier now claims 2 to 3 lives a year. And for locals, it's not just a lake, it's a graveyard, a curse, a haunting.
I don't know what it was, man. I just felt like I was being pulled.
It's a whole town underneath us.
Get the hell out of here, man.
That's what I'm saying.
The horror we live with because we refuse to face it. That is what we mean by plantation horror. Not just ghosts, but metaphor. The past creeping into the present.
Self-governed black town.
So, there are black people under us right now?
Yeah, why you think so many people die around here every year?
Because of drunk rednecks trying to fish at night, like you.
No. It's because it's haunted.
You really think it's haunted?
A lot of souls down there. That's what pulled you under. Town full of black folk. They were almost white.
Get the hell out of here, man. What are you talking about? They were almost white?
White's not a real thing, right? There's no scientific basis for it. People just become white. But the thing about being white is, it blinds you. It's easy to see the black man as cursed because you've separated yourself from him. But you don't know. You're enslaved just like him.
And that brings us to something Thomas Jefferson once admitted, despite being a slaveholder himself. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions. Jefferson saw what many still ignore, that slavery didn't just brutalize the enslaved, it corrupted the enslaver. It trained generations, white and black, to imitate cruelty, internalize violence, and pass it on. And that's not a ghost story. That's history repeating itself. And Atlanta knows that too. And apparently, in 2015, Phil Torres, on an episode of Expedition X, went down into Lake Lanier and discovered there still were graves with loved ones' memorabilia on them, meaning the graves were never actually relocated. What do you think? Is this folklore real? Let's think about it, and how does it tie into the unspoken trope of modern horror? There's a reason shows like Atlanta lean into ghost stories tied to racial history. Because if horror is supposed to tap into our deepest fears, then the plantation isn't just a backdrop, it is a monster. But Hollywood hasn't been brave enough to say that yet. And that brings us to America's original horror genre, the slave narrative. Jada Pinkett had just been crowned a final girl in Demon Knight, but Scream 2 made her the first kill.
I hate scary movies. I should be studying. You know I got a bio.
Baby, did I mention that these tickets are free? Free.
If you've ever watched a horror movie with black characters, you've probably heard this before.
I'm gonna tell you what it is, okay? What? It's a dumbass white movie about some dumbass white girls getting their white asses cut the fuck up, okay?
It's a joke that hides a bitter truth.
Well, no, all I'm saying is that the horror genre is historical for excluding the African-American element.
For decades, horror left black audiences out of the story, or made them the punchline. There's even a book titled The Black Guy Dies First, because black folks weren't just excluded from the genre, they were warnings, red shirts, foreshadowing. But long before Hollywood noticed, black writers had already invented their own form of horror, the slave narrative, a genre born not from imagination, but from survival. Writers like Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass used real-life Gothic imagery, dark attics, hidden crawl spaces, blood-stained fields. They weren't just describing trauma, they were crafting counter spells against the plantation myth. These weren't passive memoirs, they were acts of resistance. Jacobs didn't write for history books, she wrote to white Northern women, people who saw themselves as kind, educated, moral. She didn't want sympathy, she wanted action. Harriet Jacobs, in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, used Gothic elements to depict her harrowing experience in hiding, trapped in a crawl space for 7 years. By blending slave narrative and Gothic horror, Jacobs reclaims a genre built around fear and confinement, turning it into something painfully real. That fusion didn't just challenge literary tropes, it laid the groundwork for a new kind of horror, one that centers the voice of the oppressed. And this is where Toni Morrison takes it further. In her research, she cites a Jamaican planter casually describing the assault of his slaves, as though it was just another part of the job. That casual evil, that is a real monster. And Morrison understood what Jefferson once reluctantly admitted. Slavery didn't just destroy the enslaved, it deformed the enslaver. And those twisted echoes live on. So when Atlanta tells a ghost story about a haunted lake, or when Jacobs hides in the attic, or when Toni Morrison writes about a mother who's haunted by her child. It's all warning us of the same thing. The true horror of America isn't just the violence, it's the stories we tell to justify it. That's why slave narratives were always about the other, and how white supremacy needed a monster to feel human. Horror thrives on mythology, and the South is full of it. But who gets to tell those stories? That's what makes the difference. The new subgenre we're proposing, plantation horror, isn't just about trauma. It's about agency. The horror isn't just about remembering trauma. It's about reclaiming it. Some of the most powerful stories don't just show the oppressed being haunted, it shows them haunting. What if horror didn't just remember the pain, but honored the survival? And if we start there, not with ghosts, but with the voices that outlived the real terror, we don't just get a horror movie, we get catharsis. What if ghosts weren't there to scare us, but to remind us they survived? Toni Morrison once said that America can't talk about race without talking about the other. And she meant it literally. But here's the kicker. In doing that, we become strange to ourselves. We become the monster in the mirror.
I believe in putting the horror in the mind of the audience and not necessarily on the screen. As the film went on, there was less and less violence, but the tension in the mind of the viewer was increased considerably.
Hitchcock got it. Horror isn't always what you see. It's what you're afraid you'll see. And the perfect place to play that fear? A Victorian mansion on a hill. Think Psycho, Hill House, Ready or Not. The Victorian mansion is horror shorthand. It tells us something wicked lives here, even before anything happens. But here's what most people miss. Victorian isn't a style, it's a time period. The 1800s, during Queen Victoria's reign, architects blended Italianate and Greek revival features into homes meant to scream wealth. These homes became symbols of excess, and by the 1930s, they'd fallen into ruin, the perfect stage for ghosts. But guess what else was built during that same period? Antebellum mansions. The word antebellum literally means before the war, and it refers to homes built between 1830 and 1860, primarily in the American South. Like Victorian homes, they were enormous, meant to display power, built on exploitation. And while Victorian mansions became haunted houses, plantations became wedding venues. One became a symbol of horror, the other a backdrop for romance. That's not because one is scarier than the other, it's because horror, like history, has selective memory. Of course, Victorian mansions weren't always seen as haunted. Some also became wedding venues, as films like Ready or Not show, blending opulence with unease. But unlike plantations, Victorian homes didn't have to be sanitized to become scary. In Ready or Not, a wedding unfolds inside a real Gothic revival mansion, Casa Loma, built just after the Victorian era, but echoing all its grandeur and gloom. It's a house where satire and slaughter share the same ballroom. Some homes in horror are haunted by secrets, others by systems. Take The Changeling. On the surface, it's a classic haunted house story. A grieving man moves into a Victorian mansion. But beneath the floorboards is something darker. A child was murdered, not out of rage, but out of inheritance. The family needed a new heir, so they replaced the boy with another, sent him to a British boarding school. He grew up to become a US senator. That's not just a ghost story. That's a story about protecting bloodlines, about rewriting identity to preserve legacy. Or take Get Out. It's not set on a plantation, but the house operates like one. The language of control is embedded in the space. From hypnotic gazes to auction scenes, Chris becomes a commodity, just with updated tools. Both films explore the same horror, domination dressed up as civility, violence hidden behind inheritance. These houses aren't just architecture, they're ideology. And yet, while Victorian mansions like the one in The Changeling become haunted by their past, plantations get treated like Pinterest boards. Here's a teaser. In an upcoming video, we'll explore how architecture became a tool of power, from Queen Victoria to King George, and how the influence of empire shaped mansions all over the globe. From Blink Twice to Ready or Not, we'll follow the final girl through these corridors of inherited wealth, and what happens when she realizes she's surrounded. These houses aren't just about architecture, they're about control. In Ready or Not and The Changeling, the mansion represents old power, and the horror comes when someone dares to disrupt it. But in The Plantation, like in Get Out, the design itself reinforces domination. Every hallway, every gaze, every vantage point is built to remind you who's watching and who's in charge. We'll dive deeper into our video on Ready or Not versus Blink Twice. Patreon subscribers see it first. But back to The Plantation. Let's rewind to 1925. Edward Hopper paints House by the Railroad, a looming Victorian home shadowed and still. Hitchcock sees it and builds a cycle house on top of it. The image becomes horror shorthand, the past looming over the present. After World War I, Americans were trying to shake off the Gilded Age and the colonial European ties. Victorian homes felt haunted by old money and empire, so modernism surged forward. Clean lines, flat roofs, Frank Lloyd Wright. We rejected opulence by turning it into decay, and Victorian mansions became haunted houses. But plantations, they got a glow up. And just as Victorian mansions were being cast as haunted relics, Gone with the Wind gave the plantation a new identity, a symbol of grit and home during the Great Depression, with Scarlett fighting for her land in a way everyday Americans could relate to. Even in Gone with the Wind, the plantation is more ghost than home, a place people cling to or are cursed by.
Now get back to work. I can't do everything in terror all by myself. What do I care about terror? I hate terror.
Terror. Well, land's the only thing that matters.
Something you love better than me.
The red earth of terror. Terror.
Terror.
Terror.
If you ask someone to name a famous plantation in film, you probably won't hear a horror movie, because most people's first thought is Gone with the Wind. But Gone with the Wind isn't alone. Modern films still use plantations, not for horror, but for romance. What does The Notebook have to do with horror? So even when we tell a love story in the South, the plantation is often in the background, quietly shaping the aesthetics.
Oh boy.
Oh boy, indeed. In that film, we watch a deteriorating antebellum plantation, columns crumbling, shutters warped, restored as a labor of love. The house becomes a symbol of passion, dedication, romance, but the history beneath those floorboards, never acknowledged, never haunted. The transformation is the forgetting machine at work. Gone with the Wind, The Notebook. Even today, when plantations appear on screen, it's usually as a backdrop for longing, not reckoning. But that's the trick. That's what Aimé Césaire warned us about. After World War II, he described a system that turns atrocity into nostalgia, that buries genocide under charm, that calls a house built on slavery a venue. He called it the forgetting machine. And in America, the machine runs smooth.
America is afraid of itself. It is totally afraid of its own history. It has never dealt with it successfully. It really thinks it's something that it isn't, you know.
That's the unspoken trope of modern horror. Not just ghosts, but willful amnesia. Because when the mansion is Victorian, it decays. But when it's a plantation, it gets repainted, rebranded, rented out for weddings. So ask yourself, why do ghosts live in Victorian mansions, but never in plantations? Plantations are too real, too political, too uncomfortable. So they become backdrops for romance, not reckoning. But here's the thing, Hollywood knows they work. Gone with the Wind, highest grossing film ever when adjusted for inflation. 12 Years a Slave, Best Picture winner. Django Unchained, Tarantino's biggest financial hit. Get Out, horror gold, Oscar history. So, why hasn't horror gone all in? Why is horror afraid of the most haunted place in America? And most importantly, what are we so afraid to remember? The fire at Nottoway burned the house, but not the myth. In part 2, we'll dig deeper. We'll analyze the films, the characters, and the monsters that horror refuses to show. And we'll build something new, a genre we call plantation horror. The ghosts are real, and they're not who you think. Thanks for watching The Legacy of Folktales, where we curiously examine history, movies, and folklore to give context. If you want to help our small channel, please consider subscribing and following for more videos. Until next time. The Nottoway Plantation fire happened shortly before we finished the video, so we'd like to add a little epilogue to part 1 that acknowledges some of the reactions to the Nottoway Plantation fire. Enjoy.
Something paranormal is happening in this photo. If you don't know, this is the Nottoway Plantation that is going up in flames, or went up in flames, because it is gone, it's charred. But the ancestors was there while it was happening. As the flames were going up, the ancestors were there. And I want to show you how paranormal and freaky this photo is. It is not edited. I want to put a disclaimer out here. This is not edited. This is not tampered with. You can Google this image and you can zoom in for yourself. And I'm going to zoom in right here where the archways are, where the flames are happening, and show you that the ancestors was in attendance. Look at this. I can't make this up. Again, this is unedited. Do you see 2 figures in the archways? Like, I can't make that up. And so when I seen this, I was like, oh my gosh, there's spirits in that plantation. And it's like right there. Like your eyes, yes, you can make all the excuses you want, but my eyes are not lying, and I hope you guys see what I see. I see a woman right here, and I see a man right there. Okay, it's circled. You can see as clear as day in those archways. I know there's people that's going to dispel it, and that's fine. There's always going to be people who are skeptical, but I see very clearly with my 2 eyes, I see 2 spirits. It might be 2 ancestors. I know it's 2 ancestors, and they wanted to be a witness to the flames of this place going down, okay? This is a cursed plantation. All plantations are cursed, but they wanted to witness this going down, okay? So tell me what you guys think. But yeah, the ancestors were there singing This Little Light of Mine. I'm gonna let it shine. They were there. They were in attendance right here.
Plantations romanticized, and then Auschwitz is held with like deep respect, sacred ground, right? You would never get married there. That sounds insane, me just saying that, right? Huge plantation burnt down in Louisiana this morning. It got me thinking.
Nottoway was a staple in White Castle. I mean, everyone from all over the world came here to tour Nottoway. Just the history. I mean, this was built, in the Civil War. It stood this whole time, and now to see it just burned down, it's really sad.
Everybody have their own opinions on Nottoway, but it is, it is White Castle. It's one of the biggest slave plantations in Louisiana. It's historical. As White Castle, we have to think about the people, who was providing for the.
I used to be a tour guide at Nottoway Plantation. Nottoway was not talking about history properly. They regularly threatened my job because I was, quote, too emotional about the historical context and slavery there. I was...
Call it a coincidence, call it whatever you want. Annabelle, one of the most haunted and demonic things on this planet, is on tour. And it was just in New Orleans, Louisiana. And you won't believe what happened.